Congressional Testimony, Reexamining the Economic Costs of Debt by L. Randall Wray. Section 5. Sectoral Balances. One of the concepts of modern money theory economists use to elucidate the impact of budget deficits on the economy is the sectoral balance identity developed by Wynne Godley, 1996. At the level of the economy as a whole, aggregate spending is identically equal to aggregate income. Every dollar spent is received as income. It is useful to divide the economy into three sectors: government, national, state, and local; domestic private, households and firms; and foreign, rest of the world. If one sector spends more than its income, deficit, at least one other must spend less than its income, surplus, to maintain the aggregate identity that total spending equals total income. The balances, income minus expenditure, of the three sectors have to add up to zero, since we are adding up all the income in the economy and subtracting all the spending, which are equal by identity. We can then write the aggregate identity as government balance plus domestic private balance plus foreign balance equals 0. For the U.S., the government balance taken as a whole is usually negative. Government spending is greater than its revenue, mostly taxes. The domestic private balance is usually positive, approximated as saving is greater than investment. And the foreign sector balance is positive. The rest of the world has a surplus in relation to the U.S. since our current account balance is a deficit. Footnote 6. This is also referred to as net saving of the private sector, since investment is a type of expenditure and saving is what is left after consumption. In other words, we are looking at what is left of disposable income after the private sector consumes and invests. End footnote. Figure 7 shows the U.S. sectoral balances, with each sector's balance presented as a percent of GDP. It is easy to see that the government balance, red, is negative, deficit, with the exception of a brief period at the end of the 1990s. This is driven by the federal government's balance, as state and local governments generally run small surpluses. The domestic private sector blue is usually positive, with the exception of two periods: the second half of the 1990s, dot-com bubble, and the mid-2000s, housing bubble. Finally, since the time of the administration of President Reagan, the U.S. runs a chronic current account deficit, so the rest of the world runs a positive or surplus balance that has trended upward. The typical case is that the U.S. government's deficit equals the sum of the private sector's surplus and the foreign sector's surplus, which equals the U.S. current account deficit, green in the chart, with the sign reversed. The foreign sector surplus increased in the 1990s, reaching a high of 6.2% of GDP in quarter 3 of 2006. This period of relatively large current account deficits also coincided with private sector deficits. Hence, it was the private sector's deficits, some of which took the form of purchasing foreign output, rather than the government's deficit, that fell in turn into a surplus, that pushed the current account deficit higher. With the financial crisis and the Great Recession, the foreign surplus decreased to a little over 2% of GDP, and has stayed at about that level for the past decade, 2.5% average over 2009 to 2019. The changes in the government deficit have therefore largely been reflected in the domestic private sector's balance, which has been running between 3 and 4% of GDP. The government deficit increased in 2018 and 2019, largely due to the Trump administration's tax cuts. What is less understood is that with the current account not moving much, the government deficits have added to private sector surpluses. For example, the government's balance in quarter 3 of 2017 was a deficit of about 5.6% of GDP, while the private sector ran a surplus of 3.2% of GDP. As the government balance moved to a deficit of over 7% of GDP in quarter 4 of 2019, the private sector surplus increased to 4.63% of GDP. The sectoral balance relationship described above is an identity that must hold true. The government's overall deficit, driven by the federal deficit, is always at the right level to offset the sum of the private sector surplus and current account deficit, sign reversed. While we cannot necessarily ascertain causation, which could be quite complex, the sectoral balance tells us that if the U.S. domestic sector spends less than its income, saves, and the U.S. runs a current account deficit, the government will run a deficit equal to the sum of the first two. And because state and local governments normally run small surpluses, it will be the federal budget that is generally in deficit. This is in spite of the will of Congress. Whether Congress pursues a balanced budget by imposing fiscal constraint in the form of tax hikes or spending reductions, the federal budgetary outcome will be a deficit equal to the sum of the state and local government surplus, the private sector surplus, and the current account deficit. In other words, the identity constrains what is possible budgetary outcome. In other words, the identity constrains what is a possible budgetary outcome. The U.S. current account deficit, in turn, is affected by both domestic conditions and foreign conditions. U.S. net imports generally move with the business cycle. When U.S. growth is strong, net imports rise, and when the U.S. economy slumps, net imports fall. U.S. policy can affect the current account balance, although policy and economic performance in the rest of the world can foil attempts to reduce the U.S. deficit. For example, recent tariff policy might have reduced U.S. imports, but the rest of the world has retaliated so that the final outcome is uncertain. As the U.S. has run significant current account deficits since the administration of President Reagan, it is prudent to assume that this is not likely to be reversed in the near future by U.S. policy alone. In other words, we can take a current account deficit as largely independent of domestic policy. The domestic private sector generally runs a surplus. This is largely driven by the household sector, which usually spends less than its income. The business sector often runs a surplus too, but even when it runs a deficit, this is not usually big enough to offset the household sector's surplus. The decade from 1996 to 2006 was an exception, as noted above, because the household sector ran large deficits, which led to rising indebtedness, fueled by bubbles in dot-com stocks, housing, and commodities. Footnote 7. Deficits in the business sector before 2000 contributed to the overall private sector deficit. However, after 2000, the business sector ran a surplus, albeit smaller than the household sector's deficit. End footnote. To find a similar period of sustained deficit spending by the private sector, we have to look back to the 1920s. In both cases, the private sector deficits were followed by severe downturns and financial crises, the Great Depression and the Great Recession, respectively. Private sector deficits create fragile financial positions and are ultimately unsustainable. The normal sustainable balance for the private sector is therefore a surplus. If we recognize that the private sector will usually run a surplus and that the rest of the world is likely to continue to run a surplus against the U.S., we are of necessity concluding that the federal government will be running a deficit. As the U.S. transitioned to a chronic current account deficit in the mid-1980s. It is not surprising that larger federal deficits became the norm and will likely persist in spite of congressional will to reduce them. We must accept the relation presented in the identity. In order to reduce the government deficit, we must see a reduction of the domestic private sector's surplus and or foreign surplus, or current account deficit. Our current account deficit. Unfortunately, the balance with the rest of the world is not under our close control, and attempts to reduce the federal deficit may well backfire by inducing changes in the surplus or saving desired by the private sector. For example, cutting government spending or raising taxes might reduce household and business confidence and spending, generating greater attempts to accumulate saving.